Her story begins in Florida when her son shouted, "You ruined our lives. Get out." So she did. She left and cut off contact. A week passed and suddenly she had over 99 missed calls. It had only been a short time since she moved in, and already he said she was wrecking everything. His voice echoed through the hallway, louder and sharper than she thought possible. She hadn't even unpacked her suitcase yet. He stood in the doorway of the small, converted office they called a guest room. Beige carpet, thin blinds, a single window. Her suitcase still stood by the wall unopened. The pillowcase smelled like detergent, cold, unfamiliar. "Because of you," he said. "My son doesn't even have a room anymore." She stayed silent. Anything she said would only make things worse. She had been there less than 2 hours. She had just left behind a lifetime, her house, her garden, her church group. The same home where she raised her son, watched him take his first steps, painted the hallway after his father died, and buried her wedding ring under a rose bush she could no longer bear to look at. She gave all that up so she could live with them after her health had started to decline. They wanted a bigger home, space for their kids, and a little corner for her. But they couldn't afford it. So like a mother does, she sold everything, cashed her husband's CD, and paid the down payment for this 2-story house in the Florida suburbs, complete with empty promises. "You'll be part of everything," her son had said. Now he towered over her, his hands trembling with blame. "Why did you even come here, Mom? This was supposed to be our fresh start. Instead, we're rearranging everything for you. You're not royalty. You don't just show up and throw our lives off balance." She looked at him carefully. For the first time in years, she saw the tiredness in his face, the resentment in his eyes, the discomfort of someone who didn't expect her to live this long. She glanced at her suitcase, her slippers, her medications neatly packed. She hadn't brought much, but clearly, even that was too much. Sarah stood silently by the kitchen. She didn't need to speak. Her silence said enough. She nodded to herself, just a small motion to remember the moment. "I'll stay out of the way," she said softly. "I'll make it work." He scoffed, already walking away. That night she lay awake, listening to the fan hum and her grandson cry from the room across the hall. No one comforted him. No one comforted her. She had moved into a house, not a home, and already she was being edged out. The next morning she woke early, unpacked a few things, and tried to make the bed seem less like a punishment. In the kitchen, Sarah passed her without a word. The coffee was ready, but not for her. She poured herself a cup anyway and stared at the backyard. Her grandson waved at her through the glass. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. By lunchtime, she was asked to use the downstairs bathroom, for convenience, they said, and reminded not to use the dishwasher without asking. At dinner there were 4 plates, not 5. The message was clear. She wasn't part of the family. She was a burden. She washed her own plate in silence. Later, she found her half-packed suitcase had been moved into the closet, not by her. They didn't even want to see it. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out a small notebook from her purse. It was supposed to be for grocery lists or blood pressure checks. Instead she wrote, "Day 1. My name is Evelyn Parker. I sold my house to buy theirs, and today I was told I'm the reason their son has no room." The phone rang at 10:37 a.m. She was folding towels no one asked her to fold, trying to feel useful. On the other end was a woman from the bank. She asked about an application for a $215,000 home equity loan. Evelyn froze. "I didn't apply for any loan," she said. But the woman insisted, noting her signature and personal details. Evelyn knew instantly. Something wasn't right. She hadn't signed anything. She gave her social security number. After a pause, the woman told her to come in immediately. By noon, Evelyn sat in a cold bank office staring at documents she'd never seen. Documents with her name, her information, and a forged signature. She saw the errors, the slanted P, the unnecessary period. She knew exactly who had done it. That night, she helped set the table like always. For plates. No words. Midway through dinner, she calmly placed the papers on the table. Her son's face tensed. "What's this?" he asked. "You tell me," she replied. When she said she'd received a call from the bank about a forged loan application, the room went still. Her voice remained calm. "Someone used my name, my trust, my identity." Her son stood abruptly. "What do you want me to say?" he snapped. "You live here. It's your house too." "You forged my name," she said. He slammed the table. The spoon jumped. Her grandson flinched. "You don't know what it's like. We're drowning," he shouted. Then he said it, the cruelest thing of all. "Maybe it would be better if you just died already." The room froze. But Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply reached into her sweater, took out a small recorder and hit stop. "What's that?" he asked. "Proof," she answered. He stared at her, horrified. "You recorded me?" "Yes. Because I'm not stupid. This time I needed people to believe me." Sarah stepped back, pale. Evelyn nodded. "I'll leave tonight if needed." "Good," her son snapped. She smiled, not from joy but from knowing. Knowing she hadn't failed this family. They had failed her. Tom listened carefully as I laid it all out. The move, the money, the forged loan application, the voice recordings, and the documents that proved the house was mine alone. He didn't interrupt, just made a few notes and asked a few short questions when he needed to. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you're not powerless here. Legally, financially, morally, you're in the right." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "What would you like to do?" he asked. I paused. That was the question, wasn't it? By the time we ended the call, a plan had started to form, not out of revenge but out of necessity. I wasn't going to be erased in my own home. That evening I made dinner. I didn't ask who wanted what, I just cooked. No one thanked me, but they ate in silence. Mark didn't speak. Sarah tapped on her phone. The children watched a tablet between bites. It was like I wasn't even there. But I was. And this time I was paying attention. The next day I went to a notary, had copies made, and locked the originals of every legal document in a small safe I purchased from the hardware store. I hid the safe under the guest room bed, behind the frame, beneath an old quilt I'd brought from my old house. I also wrote a letter, clear, detailed, dated. I placed it in the safe too. Within a week, Tom had drafted a cease and desist letter regarding the fraudulent loan application. It was addressed to both Mark and Sarah. It stated that if any further financial activity was attempted in my name, legal action would follow. I mailed it certified. 2 days later it arrived. I know because Sarah opened the envelope right in front of me at the kitchen table. She went pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She slid the paper to Mark, who read it slowly, his jaw tight. Neither of them said a word to me, but the air changed. Quieter. Colder. More distant than before, but now it was them who walked lightly, not me. That night, Mark tried to corner me in the hallway. "You didn't have to do that," he said, voice low and angry. "We could have figured it out." I looked him in the eye for the first time in weeks. "You tried to steal from me," I said calmly. "You lied. And you used your own mother." He scoffed, but he didn't argue. Because he knew. He knew I was done being quiet. In the following days, I began looking at assisted living communities. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because I realized I wanted peace, not just proof. I contacted a realtor, quietly had the house appraised, and when the numbers came back, I made my decision. One Friday morning before anyone was awake, I packed. Not everything, just the things that mattered. My husband's old watch, my favorite books, the framed photo of my son as a baby, before the resentment, before the disappointments. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Short. Honest. I am selling the house. You'll have 60 days to make other arrangements. I wish you well. I left before they came downstairs. I walked out into the Florida morning, suitcase rolling behind me, and didn't look back. Because for the first time in months, maybe even years, I wasn't running from something. I was walking towards something myself. I told him everything, how I sold my old house, used the money for the down payment, signed the joint mortgage that, in reality, was under my name only. I spoke of the promises I'd made but never legally fulfilled, of what I had uncovered, and what they had done. Tom stayed quiet for a moment too long. Then he said, "I'll be in town Friday. I can bring a notary and we'll go over everything." I thanked him, but he cut in. "No need. You're not the first mother I've heard this from, but you might be the first one actually doing something." I hung up and sat there staring at the phone. Something had shifted deep inside. Not anger or sadness, but certainty. They assumed I was too old, too gentle, too tired to keep track of paperwork, laws, or signatures. They forgot I was once the woman who juggled 2 jobs and still had dinner ready by 6:30. They overlooked the mother who taught their son to walk without falling. Now it was time I taught them something new, how to fall without warning. Some women shout to be heard. I simply raised my eyebrows, my children, and now quietly my guard. The morning after my talk with Tom, my husband's old attorney, I made my way to the credit union downtown, a place no one in this house would think to look. I opened a checking account in my maiden name, using a P.O. box I'd rented earlier that morning. A portion of my retirement savings was moved over, discreetly, cleanly. No one noticed a thing. That same week, I began removing things from the house bit by bit. Not furniture, not yet, but items with meaning. My husband's cufflinks disappeared from my jewelry box. The heirloom locket, taken from behind the old sewing machine. The antique pie dish my mother gave me vanished from the shelf. Each item found a new place inside a small storage unit I'd rented 2 towns away. Sarah thought she was erasing me from the home, but I was simply doing the same to her. Next, I went to the bank and officially reported the forged documents. The woman who took my statement had kind eyes but spoke very little. She seemed familiar with stories like mine. "Family," she muttered, shaking her head. "Sometimes the worst ones are the ones we raise." I handed over copies of the forged signatures, samples of my handwriting from years past, and a log of calls and threats I'd recorded. That evening, as I folded laundry alone, I replayed one of those recordings. Mark's voice came through, sharp and low. "If she just died already, we wouldn't have to deal with all this." What followed wasn't Sarah objecting. It was her silence which said everything. I saved the file to a USB, marked it in red. "If I die too soon, play this." Then I made 3 copies, one for Tom, one for my safety deposit box, and one that stayed tucked in the lining of my coat, close to my heart. A few days later, Tom began the paperwork. First, he sent a cease and desist to the lending company handling the forged mortgage. That alone disrupted Mark's entire plan. Next, he filed an affidavit declaring that I was the sole owner of the home. He followed it with an emergency will, not because I was ill, but because it was clear they were waiting for that to happen. The new will was straightforward. If I passed from natural causes, everything would go to a list of charities, places like the women's shelter I used to volunteer at, and the local library that still has my name on a plaque in the children's section. Mark and Sarah were specifically excluded. And if anything happened to me under suspicious circumstances, Tom had my permission to release the recordings and press charges. He never asked if I was ready to pursue legal action yet. He knew I wasn't done. Every move I made after that was deliberate. Every smile I gave at dinner. Every polite "thank you, dear," when Sarah reheated a bowl of soup. Every time I nodded quietly, pretending I didn't hear their cruel whispers down the hall. They assumed I was fading, but really I was stepping back to get a better view. And from where I stood, I saw clearly. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They mistook age for weakness. But age made me sharper. Sharper than the knife Sarah nearly handed me blade first that morning. Sharper than the silence Mark wore to hide his guilt. Sharper than their betrayal. They never thought I'd survive. But I didn't just survive, I plotted. And with every signed form, every saved file, every thread I untangled from their lies, I moved closer to freedom. Not an escape or reclaiming. This wasn't about leaving. It was about taking back what they tried to steal with interest. It all unfolded on a Wednesday. The morning air was still heavy with dew when the moving van pulled into the driveway, as quietly as I'd arranged. The driver, a young man covered in tattoos with eyes that seemed to know secrets, just tipped his cap and said nothing. Perfect. By 7 o'clock, the hallway closet stood empty. By 8:15 my bags were zipped and ready. By 9 o'clock, the final photo of my husband was wrapped in bubble wrap and placed on the front seat of the car that came for me. I didn't say goodbye. Not because I was angry, because I was done. I had watched this house turn from promise to prison. Now it was just an address I used to occupy. Mark and Sarah were out, likely meeting with a financial advisor, scrambling to hold together whatever was left of their scheme. I didn't need them there for the ending. They'd find out soon enough. I placed a wooden box on the kitchen table. Small but heavier than anything else I left behind. Inside, a printed deed showing me as the sole owner, a formal letter revoking my promise to share the property, a copy of the bank fraud complaint with forged signatures and timestamps, 2 labeled USB drives, one with the recordings, one a backup, and a letter typed and signed in blue ink. It read, "To whom it may concern, this house no longer belongs to you." Never did. I left the box in plain sight, beside a cold pot of coffee and a pile of unpaid bills. The house didn't mourn as I left. It exhaled. By noon I walked into my new home. A furnished apartment on the 12th floor of a senior living community that overlooked the river. It was modern, quiet, and warm in ways that had nothing to do with heating. The front desk clerk handed me the keys, smiled, and said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Parker." And for the first time in years I believed it. I had already paid for everything in advance, 12 months of rent, medical services, meals. Every document carried my name, every signature was mine alone. No pressure, no coercion. The apartment smelled of lavender. The armchair near the window was soft and deep. No one here raised their voice. No one questioned my need for stillness. It was just me, and that finally was enough. That night I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea. Below, the city lights flickered like fireflies. I imagined them walking into the house expecting the same bitter woman sitting quietly in the corner. But they'd find only empty drawers, bare closets, and a box. A box that didn't scream or accuse. A box that proved I hadn't run. I'd taken back what was mine, and left them only what they deserved. Silence, consequence, and a deep echoing void where their comfort used to be. It started on the 7th day. 1 missed call. Then 2. By noon, dozens. By the next day my phone glowed red. 99 plus missed calls. No voicemails. Just silence trying to break its way back into my life. I didn't answer. I didn't block him either. Some things need to be felt. Let him stare at my name on his screen. Let his thumb hover unsure. Let the weight of being ignored settle in his gut, the same way his words once sank like stones into mine. I had nothing left for him, and now he had everything to lose. On the 8th day, a letter came, not personal, not handwritten. Just a formal notice from the law office managing the credit fraud case. Sarah's name was on the complaint. She was the one who submitted the forged documents. When her employer learned of the federal investigation, she was placed on leave. By week's end, she was out of a job. I didn't celebrate, but I did feel calm. Actions have consequences, especially when the woman you called useless has the receipts. The calls didn't stop. Mark tried different numbers, sent texts, "We need to talk." It wasn't supposed to go this far. "Please." One just said, "I'm sorry, Mom." But he wasn't sorry for what he did. Only that he'd lost control. and I wasn't giving it back. I crafted my reply carefully, waiting until it didn't sting to read. Then I attached a voice clip, him saying clear as day, "If she just died already, this would be easier." Beneath it I wrote one line. "You were once the child I loved most, but I don't recognize the man you became." Then I hit send and muted the conversation. 2 days later I got a voicemail. His voice cracked. "Mom, please just tell me you're okay. I didn't mean what I said. We were stressed. I was scared. I shouldn't have forged your name. I know that now. I just..." Silence. "I didn't think you'd really leave. That was always the mistake. They never believed I could leave. To them, I was a fixture, someone who gave and gave without running dry. But a mother can walk away. And I did. Not out of vengeance but to survive. And he would have to live with that truth." That evening I sat on my new balcony, blanket across my knees, a glass of water beside me. The sun dipped low, painting the skyline gold. A neighbor waved from the next balcony, a mystery novel in one hand and a cat curled in her lap. I smiled, because this life, this peace, this silence was finally mine. Not borrowed, not begged, mine. And I would never trade it again. Not for guilt, not for apology, not even for the boy I once sang to sleep. Some doors once shut should remain that way. Some mornings now I forget what sorrow tasted like. Outside my window a citrus tree blooms. Yes, even in winter. I sip my coffee and listen to the birds fuss over crumbs. And I don't marvel at the quiet. I marvel at the lightness. How it feels to live without the invisible weight I'd carried for decades. The guilt, the pause, that quiet longing of always being needed but never acknowledged. I used to think motherhood meant vanishing. That the best kind of mother was one who became part of everything but visible in nothing, holding up everyone without ever being seen. But I don't think that way anymore. After I moved into the senior home, I made myself a small promise to say yes more often. I said yes to watercolor classes, to poetry nights at the library, to a weekend bus ride to Savannah, where I ate shrimp and grits by the water and danced barefoot with women who had stopped asking for permission to be happy. Soon my drawer overflowed with travel brochures, Greece, Portugal, Montana, Japan. I didn't mind aching knees or bringing extra pills. I had time. I had savings. And for the first time I had no one standing in my way. I joined a women's travel group for those over 60, called Golden Miles. There were 10 of us on that first trip, all in big hats and practical shoes, but we weren't fragile. We were bold. We laughed like teenagers along the Amalfi Cliffs. We whispered old truths beneath Kyoto's cherry blossoms. And in Amsterdam we cried together at the Anne Frank house, not because we were broken but because we were alive. Each morning I woke somewhere new and reminded myself, I am not invisible. I am not a burden. I am not waiting to fade. I am living finally for me. On a cruise down the Danube I met Samuel, a kind widower from Maine. He was old-school polite, holding chairs and saying ma'am, but his jokes carried a quiet sorrow. We sat next to each other at dinner, and when I offered him the last roll he said, "Only if you'll take half." That's how it began, not in sparks but in tenderness. He shared stories about his late wife and the daughter he raised alone who now called too little and lived too far. I shared about Mark, but only the parts that didn't still sting. Samuel never asked for more than I was ready to give, and that meant everything. By the end of the cruise we had breakfasted together each morning, read side by side, shared dessert, and held hands beneath the stars. It wasn't a love that overwhelmed. It was a love that held steady. When the cruise ended we made no promises, only agreed to write and maybe travel again. That was more than enough, more than I ever imagined. Back in Florida one afternoon, I got a letter from Jean, the same friend who once told me about Mark's divorce. Inside was a smaller envelope with a handwritten note. Jean wrote that Mark had come by asking for my address. She didn't give it, but she did tell him something else. Your mother is doing better than I've ever seen her. She said he looked like someone had told him the sun would never rise again. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just sat with that. With the weight of knowing he had finally lost access to the one person who had always believed in him. And I no longer needed him to be anything more. Now I paint more, even if I'm no good. My roses look like red cabbages, and my clouds like potatoes, but they make me smile. I picked up French again just for fun. I bake with almond flour even though I can't stand it because I can. I've become the woman I once wished my mother had the chance to be. Not out of luck, but because I stopped asking for permission. I didn't shout, didn't seek revenge, didn't shame. I just reclaimed what was mine, my name, my space, my peace, my kindness, and gave it back to the one who truly deserved it, me. Have you ever felt like you were only loved when you were giving? When your hands were full of help, full of food or money or answers? When you held the family together like glue, invisible but essential? And the moment you stopped, the silence grew louder, and their eyes turned cold? That love you thought was unconditional now had terms. If you've ever sat at a table that used to feel like home and suddenly felt like a stranger, if you've ever stayed awake wondering, did they love me, or just what I gave them? Know this, you're not alone. More importantly, you're not finished. Your worth doesn't age out. It doesn't vanish when your joints ache, or when you can't give like you used to. It's not measured by what you do for others, how often you said yes, or how long you stayed silent. Your worth lives in your memory, in your stillness, in the way you always knew and waited. Because silence isn't weakness. And true strength doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one saw coming, the quiet one, the kind one, the one who left with everything they thought they controlled. We've been called burdens. Selfish for finally saying no. Told to be grateful, to be quiet, to stay in our lane. But here's the truth. Dignity doesn't ask for approval. Real kindness, the kind that comes from the heart, is never owed. It's a gift. And it can be withdrawn when taken for granted. So if you're carrying a story, a betrayal you've never voiced, a sacrifice never thanked, know this. It's never too late. To speak, to remember, to reclaim, to begin again, not as who you were for them, but as who you've always been for you. You are not just a mother, not just a grandmother, not just the extra seat at the table. You are the lead, the keeper of memory, the bearer of truth. And when you speak, people listen. So subscribe to Grandpa True Stories, because we don't whisper the truth anymore. We remember it, we tell it, and we live what remains with fierce, unapologetic grace. Dignity, like justice, has no expiration date. So pull up a chair, turn it up, and listen closely. When a grandma speaks, it's not just a story. It's truth carried through time, and finally set free.